Welcome to The Debate. Today we're examining one of the most compelling and, frankly, frustrating paradoxes of the 20th century, the story of Hedy Lamarr. She was, this iconic golden age screen siren, the star of epics like Samson and Delilah, celebrated for her dazzling beauty, but at the same time, just devastatingly dismissed for her profound intellectual genius, a genius that resulted in the co-invention of frequency-hopping spread spectrum, which is, it's the foundational technology for our entire modern wireless world. Wi-Fi, GPS, everything.
It is a truly stunning contrast. Here's a woman who offered her patented secret communication system, a genuine wartime breakthrough, and she was told by the U.S. Navy that, her intellect was secondary, that she could better serve the war effort by selling bonds and offering kisses to donors.
And that stark rejection, right there, that's the cornerstone of our central question today. We have to determine, was Hedy Lamarr's tragic lack of recognition primarily due to the failure of society, Hollywood, the Navy, the public, to see past her manufactured glamorous image?
Or was the initial 1942 rejection rooted in legitimate, if maybe short-sighted, technological and structural constraints of a wartime bureaucracy? And that distinction between a kind of systemic psychological bias and a practical structural difficulty, it's absolutely crucial.
I hold that societal perception, the blinding power of her celebrity beauty, was the primary impediment. It was the fatal flaw in the system that judged her.
And I come at it from a different angle. While that bias and the professional humiliation she suffered were undeniable and insulting, I would argue that the immediate 1942 rejection was structurally and technologically driven. It just highlights the sheer complexity of integrating a system that was, decades ahead of its time?
I see why you emphasize the technical side. But let me offer another perspective. Lamarr's story for me is the ultimate case study in how beauty becomes a cage for the mind. Not her own mind, of course, which was brilliantly inventive, but for the minds of those in power who were judging her work. She was defined entirely by her looks, marketed by the studios as the pinnacle of beauty. And this image, this very specific currency of fame, it became an insurmountable obstacle. They were psychologically primed to see only the surface.
That image was certainly pervasive. I won't argue that. But how can we be certain it was the primary factor in that specific 1942 military rejection? Wartime industrial leaders, naval officials, they're trained to be ruthless pragmatists about logistics, not, film critics.
Well, the evidence is right there in the Navy's response itself, the systemic psychological dismissal. She presents this sophisticated, patented, revolutionary idea, a solution she developed out of an intellectual crisis focused on defeating the fascism she witnessed firsthand while married to the munitions dealer Friedrich Moundel. She offered her mind, her unique perspective on signal jamming. And what did they do? They rejected the idea and explicitly valued her face over her intellect by asking her to sell war bonds. This wasn't some quiet technical rejection. It was a public statement that her celebrity value was more important than her intellectual contribution. For a woman whose moral true north was fighting fascism, this was just an unthinkable professional humiliation based purely on prejudice.
That's a compelling assessment of the humiliation, and I don't want to minimize the offense. But if we focus strictly on the decision made by high-level procurement officials in 1942, we have to acknowledge the very specific constraints they were facing. Lamarr's invention, which she developed with the composer George Antheil, was extraordinarily advanced. It synthesized concepts from music, mechanics, and munitions. It used a highly complex player-piano mechanism, a roll, to precisely synchronize the switching between 88 radio frequencies.
A brilliant analog solution to the problem.
Brilliant, yes, but mechanically cumbersome and very novel. The source material notes that Navy officials allegedly quipped that you couldn't fit a player piano inside a torpedo. Now, that's more than a casual remark. It suggests a genuine practical logistical hurdle related to size, complexity, reliability, and crucially, immediate integration into existing supply chains. And on top of that, Lamarr was a self-taught inventor. In a high-stakes wartime bureaucracy, her status, while irrelevant to the quality of the invention, made her a sort of compromised narrator of this highly advanced military tech. That just adds to the structural reluctance to implement something so untested.
Okay, let's focus on that rejection, because this is the hinge of the entire thing. Interpreting the Navy's decision in that war bonds tour. My position is that the war bonds exchange was the naked expression of the paradox. The Navy wasn't just being short-sighted in a pragmatic sense. They were openly stating that her fame, her face, was a superior weapon to her idea.
But her contribution through those bond tours was astronomical. She raised $7 million. That translated into essential resources used immediately by the Allies. The Navy was facing a global catastrophe. They had to prioritize an undeniably effective source of funding over taking an enormous gamble on a highly complex, untested guidance system that might not have been industrialized for months, maybe years. They made a pragmatic, immediate calculation.
That interpretation feels like it tries to sanitize a moment of profound intellectual injustice. It frames it purely as pragmatism. If the technology was genuinely viable, and if the Navy had the intellectual capacity to recognize the genius of frequency hopping, a concept that would secure the future of wireless communication, they wouldn't have just dismissed her. They would have sequestered her, assigned a team of their best engineers, and tried to simplify the mechanism.
But that assumes the existing bureaucracy was capable of that level of innovative agility during peak warfare. It probably wasn't. The Navy's structure was designed for scaling up proven technology, not the kind of conceptual leap Lamarr and Antheil were asking for. The technological skepticism, that player piano point, it suggests genuine engineering-based doubt about real-world deployment, regardless of who invented it. This was about rapid industrialization, and a mechanism relying on precision clockwork and paper rolls just didn't fit that model in 1942.
I just disagree, fundamentally. The opportunity cost of their intellectual inertia was immense. The patent proved the principle was sound. Their failure was in intellectual management. They failed to look for the brilliance that may lie beneath an unexpected surface precisely because they were blinded by that surface.
I'll acknowledge the failure to integrate the idea later, but let's shift to the second point, the role of novelty and technical feasibility in 1942. You frame the technical issues as a convenient excuse for bias, but let's consider the mechanics. They were using a physical synchronization mechanism, that paper roll, to coordinate 88 simultaneous radio frequencies. That requires incredibly high precision and maintenance under harsh combat conditions.
Which was the state of the art for analog control at the time. The player piano was a very clever use of existing, reliable technology.
Clever, yes, but entirely novel for naval ordnance. Wartime tech prioritizes robust, proven, easily maintained methods. So was the U.S. Navy fundamentally wrong to hesitate on implementing a completely new, complex system based on paper rolls inside a torpedo that had to withstand massive G-forces and deep-sea pressure? It required a conceptual leap in manufacturing that the existing military-industrial structure was simply incapable of making in such a compressed time frame.
I think that ignores the unique origin of her expertise. Her insight wasn't abstract. It was forged in her terrifying ringside education and munitions while married to Mondel, who was arming Mussolini. She gained a unique, expert perspective on weapons vulnerability. She identified the specific critical vulnerability, radio signal jamming, and she devised a patented, specific fix.
She was certainly an informed observer, I'll grant you, but she didn't have the formal engineering credentials or military experience that would typically validate a system of this magnitude.
But the failure was intellectual inertia, not just technical impossibility. The technical constraints, sure, they could have been solved with resources, but the psychological constraint, the inability of officials to perceive genius beneath that glamorous facade, that was insurmountable. They were structurally blind to the solution because of who was presenting it.
And yet, if that system had been presented by, say, a quiet male engineer from MIT who proposed the exact same player piano solution, I maintain that the rejection in 1942 would still have been likely, purely based on the logistical infeasibility of synchronizing 88 frequencies with that mechanism under wartime pressure. the structural limitations were perhaps more powerful than the individual bias. It was a failure of the military R&D pipeline to accept any external, non-traditional solution.
Which brings us right back to the psychological factor. The reason they didn't even try to incorporate it into the R&D pipeline was because they had an immediate, easy out. Send the beautiful actress on a tour. They didn't feel the need to apply their intellectual resources to her problem because her identity gave them a different way to use her.
Okay, so this leads us to the final point. Lamarr's celebrity. Was it ultimately a tool, or was it a trap?
My argument is that her fame provided necessary freedom and access. Absolutely. It was the tool that let her escape Mondale, meet Louis B. Mayer, get access to people like Howard Hughes, who actually encouraged her inventive spirit. But ultimately, her celebrity became the trap. It blinded the world to her deepest purpose, her fight against fascism, her moral true north. The world accepted her image, her enormous fame, but tragically failed to look for the deep intellectual purpose that drove her. That persistent psychological barrier ensured her legacy was unrecognized for decades. Her beauty was the ticket to entry, but it was also the velvet prison that kept her greatest contribution locked away.
I see why you argue it became a trap, especially when recognition was denied later. But I maintain that her stardom was an essential tool for the creation itself. Her celebrity provided the platform and the unique resources she needed to meet people like Anthel, a radical composer, and pursue inventing as an anchor in a storm-tossed life. But at what cost?
Well, consider her connections. She was corresponding with Howard Hughes about aerodynamics. Her access allowed her to see the grand hidden machinery of technology, where other actors only saw a script. The brilliance of the conception, using a musical analogy to guide weapons, was enabled by the unique vantage point her celebrity provided. Without that access, without the financial stability her acting gave her, she would never have been in the position to develop the system with Anthel in the first place. But that access came at the crippling costs of credibility. Her celebrity made her a compromised narrator to the military establishment. The price of admission to that world of fame was the world's refusal to accept her seriousness. The Navy's response, the War Bonds Tour, was the ultimate manifestation of that prejudice.
We are circling the critical distinction here. The psychological failure of the Navy to take her seriously versus the structural failure to integrate a radically novel mechanism into an established pipeline in 1942. I believe the structural failure was the necessary condition for the rejection. Even if Lamarr had been a male professor, that player-piano mechanism was just too cumbersome and fragile for immediate deployment. The technical issues of wartime manufacturing acted as a brake.
But if the principle, the sheer genius of frequency hopping was correctly identified, the mechanism could have been developed later. They failed to pursue the principle because they dismissed the source. Their reaction was visceral. They saw the actress and rejected the inventor instantaneously. It was a profound reflection of society's inability to reconcile beauty and genius in one woman.
And that is the crux of the tragedy. The Navy's short-sightedness meant the patent lay dormant until it expired, only to be rediscovered and modernized later with solid-state electronics, which proved the genius was sound all along. But that initial failure was rooted in a practical impossibility of implementation at that critical wartime moment.
To summarize my position then, Hedy Lamarr's story remains a powerful warning. Society was structurally and psychologically unable to see the inventor because the actress was too blindingly bright. The tragedy of her legacy is defined by the moment the world chose her face over her idea, a choice that reveals a profound, persistent societal blind spot.
And my summary is that the paradox is far more complex than just prejudice. While bias undeniably played a role, especially in the lack of later recognition, the initial rejection in 1942 highlighted the specific, overwhelming structural and technical challenges of adopting technology that was literally decades ahead of its time. We have to balance the undeniable offense with the practical difficulties facing a wartime bureaucracy that demanded instant, field-tested solutions.
The material really demands that we recognize how a noble commitment, her determination to defeat Hitler, could curdle into a legacy of unrecognized genius simply because of how her celebrity distorted perception.
And it forces us to grapple with whether we should even try to separate the actress from the inventor, because one really did enable the other. The complexity of how perception impacts recognition in her story remains, well, profound and relevant.